I'm absolutely jaw-droppingly amazed that the Conservatives adopted net zero policies under Boris Johnson. It's like, what the hell were they thinking? You know, the most skeptical part of my brain, and I suppose the rude part, thinks that this was cooked up by Boris Johnson to impress his young wife on the personal side. And that the Conservatives as well as a group lacked a vision so comprehensively that they had to turn to this idiot climate apocalypse mongering that's used by power-mad tyrants to cow the public into delivering them all the authority and power. And so I just can't wrap my head around the Conservative shift to net zero. The economics of a shift to net zero are so appallingly catastrophic that it's a miracle that anybody who could count would even ever consider it. What in the world was going on with the Conservatives? Where were their heads at?
Well, you're right, but I think that Boris Johnson's new, much younger wife, Carrie, or Carrie Antoinette, as she's known, I think she perhaps did play something of a part in this, but it was broader than that. It was broader than that. You know, David Cameron in 2010 became a Conservative Prime Minister, and he and his sidekick, George Osborne, the Chancellor, they saw themselves as the heir to Blair. They were essentially globalists. They were essentially career politicians. And they don't like to be criticised. They don't like the Twitterati. They don't like the G7, or whatever it may be. They don't want to stand out from the crowd. They haven't got the courage of their convictions. They haven't actually got any real convictions. And so we've been priding ourselves that we've cut carbon emissions more than any other Western country. We have cut carbon emissions by 44% since 1990. And do you know how we've done it? We've deindustrialized. We've deindustrialized. Our steel plants closed down. They go to India, where the steel is produced under lower environmental protections. And then guess what? The steel goods are shipped back to the United Kingdom. We haven't actually reduced global CO2 emissions. We've just exported it to other countries. And we have transferred vast amounts of wealth from the poorest to the richest. And even in terms of a CO2 debate and emissions, frankly, globally, we've achieved almost nothing. And I think it's a combination of woolly thinking, but above all, cowardice. And this is really my complaint about the so-called Conservative Party. They are cowardly. They want to be popular amongst the right circles in the smart dinner party set in London. They can't stand the pile-on that happens on social media, and they're in politics, and you'd think they're still, you know, in a university debating society. It's all a great big game. It's all about climbing the greasy pole. It's not about conviction.
Let me ask you about carbon dioxide. I want to ask you a hard question. Many of the Conservatives that I talk to now, small c Conservatives, are beginning to push back against the climate apocalypse mongers, but they're still doing it pretty apologetically. And so, you know, I've been looking at the data on carbon dioxide production for about 15 years, trying to sort it out. And my view as a scientist who's capable of assessing data is that if we were taking a dispassionate look at the situation, one that wasn't informed by the Club of Rome overpopulation doomsayers, for example, that we would conclude that by historical standards over periods of millions of years instead of thousands, the planet is actually in a pretty severe carbon dioxide drought, and that the influx of carbon dioxide from the fossil fuel industry into the atmosphere is actually a net ecological good. And the reason I think this is because there's one piece of data that leaps out at me that is so large that it seems to put everything else in the shadow. And that is that in the last 20 years alone, the planet has greened by an area factor of 20%, which is twice as big as the continental United States. Now, that's not all. Not only has it got greener, and a lot greener, the places that got greener were primarily semi-arid areas. In fact, exactly the areas that the climate doomsayers said would turn into outright desert as the planet warmed. not only were they wrong in the opposite direction. And then we could add to the fact, and this is like straight up NASA data, I'm not making any of this up, that crops themselves, the crops we depend on to eat, have increased their productivity by something approximating 15% along with this additional greening. It seems to me that it's time for people who are not fond of the climate fearmongers to not be apologetic about their opposition, quite the contrary. Now, I'm curious about what you do think about the climate crisis per se. And, already made the case that Britain's attempts to address it have done nothing but enrich India and China and likely increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere anyways because of the laxer environmental standards in those countries. I think that's true, but I'm not sure that gets at the issue as deeply as perhaps it might be addressed. So anyways, I'll put you on the spot with regards to that.
Well, I don't understand the science of it, and I haven't studied that aspect of it as much as you have. I've looked more at what we're doing in the name of dealing with the problem and my criticisms of that. But I would say this. I do find it extraordinary that people call carbon dioxide a pollutant. Because as I understand it, plants don't grow without carbon dioxide, and you're talking about the earth being much greener than it was.